The frost clung to the windows of the signal box like crystallized cobwebs as Hans Müller pulled the night shift lever at Munich's Ostbahnhof station on March 15, 1946. The ancient clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., its metallic ticking the only companion in the suffocating silence of post-war Germany. His calloused hands, stained with years of grease and coal dust, trembled slightly as he reached for his thermos of ersatz coffee, not from the cold that seeped through every crack in the wooden structure, but from the weight of what he had witnessed 3 nights ago. The 51-year-old railway signal operator had spent 32 years learning every track, every switch, every peculiar rhythm of trains passing through this junction. He knew which locomotives whistled with a high-pitched squeal, which freight cars clattered with loose axles, and which passenger trains ran precisely on schedule. But the train that had slipped through his station at 2:17 a.m. on March 12 had been different, unnaturally quiet, deliberately unmarked, and traveling on a route that officially didn't exist anymore. What happened in the next 18 days would expose the most sophisticated Nazi escape network in occupied Germany and bring to justice war criminals who thought they had vanished into the night. Hans hadn't been born into the world of international conspiracies and war crimes tribunals. His story began 51 years earlier in the Bavarian village of Rosenheim, where his father worked as a blacksmith and his mother tended a small vegetable garden behind their timber-framed house. The youngest of 4 children, Hans grew up in a world governed by the rhythms of rural life, the clang of his father's hammer on the anvil, the smell of fresh bread from his mother's kitchen, and the distant whistle of trains passing through the valley below. It was those trains that captured young Hans's imagination. "Why do you spend so much time watching the railway, Hans?" his mother would ask, finding him perched on the hillside overlooking the tracks. "Because they're going somewhere, Mama," he would reply. "They know exactly where they're going, and they always get there." This fascination with the precision and purpose of railways became the defining passion of his youth. While other boys dreamed of becoming soldiers or merchants, Hans sketched railway maps and memorized train schedules. At 14, when his father's health began to fail from years of hard labor, Hans left school to seek employment. He found work as a track maintenance assistant for the Bavarian State Railways, spending long days inspecting rail joints, replacing worn ties, and learning the intricate mechanics that kept Germany's expanding railway system operational. "You have an eye for detail, boy," his supervisor told him after 6 months. "You notice things others miss. That's a rare quality." By 1918, at the age of 23, Hans had been promoted to signal operator at a small junction station outside Rosenheim. The Great War was ending, and Germany was collapsing into chaos, but the trains still had to run. Hans took pride in maintaining order in his small corner of the world, ensuring that every train passed safely through his junction, regardless of what chaos reigned beyond the railway embankment. He married Greta Hoffmann in 1920, a schoolteacher's daughter with intelligent eyes and a pragmatic disposition. They had 2 children, Friedrich in 1921 and Anna in 1924, and settled into a modest apartment near the Munich railway yards where Hans had transferred to take a better position. The couple lived quietly through the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, the economic collapse, and the rise of the Nazi Party. Hans was not political by nature. He joined the Nazi Railway Workers' Union because it was required, attended the mandatory rallies because refusing would have cost him his position, and kept his head down as the world around him descended into madness. When the war came in 1939, Hans was deemed too old and too essential to railway operations for military service. He watched his son Friedrich board a train to the Eastern Front in 1941 and received the telegram informing him of Friedrich's death at Stalingrad in 1943. His daughter Anna disappeared in the chaos of 1944, last seen boarding a train to Berlin with her fiancé, a Luftwaffe officer. Hans never learned what became of her. By 1945, when Allied bombs reduced much of Munich to rubble, Hans and Greta had lost everything except each other and Hans's position at the railway. The signal box at Ostbahnhof became his sanctuary, a place where orders still existed, where switches worked according to logic, where trains still followed their appointed paths even as the world burned. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Hans expected his life to become simpler. The war was over. The trains would carry reconstruction supplies instead of soldiers and weapons. Life would return to something resembling normalcy. What he didn't anticipate was that some trains would continue to carry human cargo desperate to escape the justice that was finally catching up with them. The first anomaly Hans noticed occurred on a bitter night in February 1946. He was logging the evening's train movements in his official ledger when he realized that a freight train had passed through his junction without any corresponding paperwork. In the regimented world of railway operations, this was virtually impossible. Every train had documentation, authorization codes, and manifests. Yet this train, which he had personally switched onto the southern track at 1:43 a.m., existed nowhere in the official schedule. "Perhaps I made an error in the logs," he mentioned to his supervisor the next morning, a former Wehrmacht logistics officer named Brown, who had seamlessly transitioned into railway administration. "I have a train in my personal notes that doesn't appear in the master schedule." Brown barely looked up from his paperwork. "You're working too many night shifts, Muller. You're seeing trains that aren't there. At your age, perhaps you should consider requesting day assignments." Hans knew he hadn't imagined the train. He had stood in the signal box and watched it pass, had thrown the switches personally, had heard the peculiar diesel engine that sounded nothing like the coal-fired locomotives that typically moved freight through this junction. But he said nothing more to Brown. Over the following weeks, Hans began paying closer attention to the night trains. He started keeping a second ledger, unofficial and hidden in his signal box, where he recorded every train that passed through his junction regardless of whether it appeared in the master schedule. By early March, he had documented 7 ghost trains that traveled exclusively during his night shifts, always between midnight and 4 a.m., always heading south toward the Austrian border. The trains followed a pattern that his methodical mind couldn't ignore. They appeared every 4 to 6 days, always used the same southbound track, and never carried any external markings or identification numbers. Most suspicious was that they moved with the absolute minimum of light, their windows covered or darkened, as if trying to remain invisible. Hans's suspicions crystallized on the night of March 12th, when mechanical trouble forced him to personally inspect a switch that had frozen in the unseasonable cold. As he worked to free the mechanism, one of the ghost trains approached. Hans stepped back into the shadows beside the track as the train slowed for the junction, and in that moment, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Through a partially covered window of one of the passenger cars, he glimpsed faces, but these weren't the faces of ordinary travelers. The men inside wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with military bearing. More disturbing was what he saw one man doing, studying maps with another passenger. Maps that even from a distance Hans could identify as showing routes through the Alps into Italy. The train passed, switching onto the southern track, and disappeared into the darkness. Hans stood in the cold for several minutes after it vanished, his mind racing through the implications of what he had witnessed. Post-war Germany in early 1946 was a landscape of ruins and reconstruction, administered by the 4 Allied powers who had divided the defeated nation into occupation zones. Munich sat in the American zone, where U.S. military authorities worked alongside German civil administrators to restore order and root out the remnants of Nazi power. The Nuremberg trials had begun in November 1945, putting major war criminals on trial before the world. But it had become increasingly clear to Allied investigators that many high-ranking Nazis and SS officers had simply vanished in the chaos of the war's final months. Estimates suggested that thousands of individuals wanted for war crimes had escaped Germany, but the mechanisms of their escape remained frustratingly obscure. The Allied authorities knew that escape networks existed. Rumors spoke of ratlins that moved fugitives through Europe to safe havens in South America, the Middle East, and Spain. They knew that sympathetic Catholic clergy sometimes provided assistance, that forged documents circulated through underground networks, and that former Nazi intelligence officers had established connections that could be exploited. What they didn't know were the specific routes, the safe houses, the transportation methods being used. Railway networks were obvious candidates for moving fugitives, but investigating every train in occupied Germany was impossible. The sheer volume of legitimate traffic, the chaos of reconstruction, and the deliberate destruction of records by fleeing Nazis created an investigative nightmare. American counterintelligence corps officers worked tirelessly to identify and capture war criminals, but they were searching for needles in a haystack that covered an entire continent. In Munich, the CIC maintained a field office in a requisitioned building on Lippe, staffed by a mixture of American intelligence officers and German civilians who had been carefully vetted and cleared for employment with the occupation authorities. One of these employees was Klaus Weber, a former railway administrator who had been imprisoned by the Nazis for political unreliability and now worked as a liaison between the CIC and German railway operations. Hans had known Klaus before the war, had worked with him briefly in the 1930s before Klaus's arrest. He knew Klaus to be a man of integrity who had suffered for his opposition to the Nazi regime, and it was to Klaus that Hans decided to bring his suspicions. On March 16th, during his day off, Hans made his way through the rubble-strewn streets of Munich to the CIC office. The city was still a landscape of destruction. Entire neighborhoods reduced to skeletal remains of buildings, mountains of rubble being slowly cleared by work gangs. He found Klaus in a small office, surrounded by railway schedules and freight manifests. "Hans Müller," Klaus said with genuine warmth, rising to shake his hand. "It's good to see you survived the madness. What brings you here?" Hans explained what he had observed, describing the ghost trains with the precision of someone who had spent 32 years in railway operations. Klaus listened intently, asking occasional questions but revealing nothing in his expression. When Hans finished, Klaus was silent for a long moment. "What you're describing could be explained several ways," Klaus finally said. "There's still significant confusion in railway operations. The military moves supplies and personnel without always coordinating with civilian authorities. It might be nothing, or it might be something," Hans replied quietly. "Those men I saw didn't look like soldiers or refugees. They looked like officers trying to disappear." Klaus studied his old colleague carefully. "If you're right, Hans, this is extremely serious, but I need to ask you something important. If these trains are what you think they are, continuing to observe them could be dangerous. Are you prepared for that?" Hans thought of his son, buried somewhere in the frozen wasteland of Russia. He thought of his daughter, vanished into the maelstrom of the war's final days. He thought of the millions who had suffered and died because people like him had kept their heads down and followed orders. "I'm prepared," he said simply. "What do you need me to do?" Klaus reached into his desk and withdrew a pad of paper. "I need you to document everything. Times, descriptions, any identifying features of the trains or passengers. Can you do that without raising suspicion?" Over the next week, Hans transformed his signal box into an unofficial observation post. He kept his hidden ledger updated with meticulous detail, noting every anomaly he observed. He began arriving early for his night shifts, using the extra time to inspect the tracks and switches more carefully than required, looking for any evidence that might reveal where the ghost trains originated or what routes they followed beyond his junction. On March 19th, Hans made a discovery that seemed insignificant but struck him as important. While inspecting a siding that the ghost trains frequently used, he found a discarded cigarette package, a brand called Helmar that had been popular among Wehrmacht officers but was now nearly impossible to obtain in occupied Germany. It suggested that whoever was riding these trains had access to supplies that ordinary Germans lacked. 2 nights later, on March 21st, Hans was in his signal box when he heard the distinctive approach of another ghost train. He dimmed his lantern and moved to the window, watching as the train slowed for the junction. This time, the train stopped completely, something the previous ghost trains had never done. Hans's heart hammered in his chest as he watched a figure emerge from one of the cars and walk along the track, inspecting something. In the faint moonlight, Hans could see the man clearly, middle-aged, wearing a long coat, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The man approached Hans's signal box, and for a terrifying moment, Hans thought he had been discovered. But the man merely examined the switch mechanism, seemed satisfied, and returned to the train, which resumed its journey moments later. Hans waited until the train disappeared before his hands stopped shaking enough to write down what he had observed. The next morning, he reported to Klaus at the CIC office, describing the stopped train and the inspecting passenger. Klaus's expression had changed from cautious interest to grave concern. "Hans, I need to bring someone else into this conversation, an American officer. Are you willing to speak with him?" That afternoon, Hans found himself sitting across a desk from Captain Robert Morrison, a young counterintelligence corps officer with sharp eyes and an interpreter who translated between Hans's limited English and Morrison's non-existent German. Hans repeated his observations, answered detailed questions about railway operations, and described the patterns he had identified. "Mr. Muller," Morrison said through the interpreter, "what you're describing matches intelligence we've received from other sources about a possible escape network operating through the Munich railway system. but we've been unable to identify the specific trains or routes being used. Your information could be crucial. What do you need from me?" Hans asked. Morrison leaned forward. "We need proof, documented evidence that will allow us to intercept one of these trains and identify who's aboard. That means you'll need to continue your observations and provide us with advance warning when the next train is scheduled." "How will I know when they're coming?" Morrison smiled slightly. "You're the railway expert, Mr. Muller. You tell me." Hans thought for a moment. "If I'm right about the pattern, the next train should come through in 3 to 5 days, between midnight and 3 a.m., always on the southern track heading toward the Austrian border. Then we'll be ready," Morrison said. "But Mr. Muller, I need you to understand something. If this network is what we suspect, the people running it are dangerous. Former SS officers, Nazi intelligence operatives, men with nothing left to lose. If they discover you're observing them, I understand." Hans interrupted. "I've already made my choice, Captain." What Hans couldn't know as he returned to his signet box that evening was that his observations had provided the first solid lead in a months-long investigation into one of the most sophisticated Nazi escape networks in Europe. American intelligence had been tracking rumors of an organization called Die Spin, the Spider, which allegedly moved high-value fugitives out of Germany using a network of safe houses, forged documents, and carefully planned transportation routes. The organization was believed to be run by former SS officers and funded by hidden Nazi assets that had been secreted away before Germany's collapse. But despite months of investigation, the CIC had been unable to identify any of the organization's operatives or interdict any of its escape routes. Hans Muller's careful observations of the ghost trains provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. On the night of March 24th, Hans arrived at his signal box to find a subtle change. A small mark on the wall, a chalk symbol that Klaus had told him to watch for. It meant that American intelligence officers were in position nearby, waiting for the next ghost train. Hans settled into his routine, checking switches, logging the evening's legitimate traffic, and watching the clock. At 1:33 a.m., he heard it, the distinctive diesel engine of a ghost train approaching from the north. Hans moved to his window and watched as the train materialized out of the darkness, its windows covered, its markings obscured. Following the procedure Klaus had outlined, Hans switched the train onto the southern track as expected, but added one small modification. He delayed throwing the final switch by precisely 30 seconds, forcing the train to slow more than usual as it navigated the junction. Those 30 seconds gave the CIC surveillance team time to photograph the train, its cars, and several passengers who were visible through incompletely covered windows. The train passed through and continued south, its passengers unaware that they had just been documented by American intelligence. Hans completed his shift, logged his observations in his hidden ledger, and went home as dawn broke over the ruined city. He said nothing to Greta about what he had done, maintaining the fiction that he was simply working his usual night shifts. That afternoon, Klaus appeared at Hans's apartment with news. The photographs captured clear images of at least 4 men wanted for war crimes. Klaus said quietly, after ensuring they were alone. "One of them is Otto Hartmann, a former SS Standartenführer, who commanded an Einsatzgruppe in Poland. He's wanted for the murder of at least 2,000 civilians." Hans felt his stomach tighten. Men like Hartmann were the architects of the nightmare that had consumed his son, his daughter, millions of innocents, and he had been riding past Hans's signal box, escaping justice, while Hans threw switches to send him on his way. "What happens now?" Hans asked. Morrison's answer came the following evening at a hurried meeting in Klaus's office. "We're going to intercept the next train. Based on your pattern analysis, that should be in 3 to 4 days. We'll need your help to coordinate the operation." The plan was audacious and complex. When the next ghost train approached, Hans would switch it onto a siding instead of the main southern track. The siding led to an abandoned freight yard that the CIC would fill with armed personnel disguised as railway workers and occupation police. The train would be trapped, its passengers arrested, and the escape network's operation exposed. "There's significant risk," Morrison acknowledged. "If the train's operators are monitoring the switches, or if someone in the German Railway Administration is working with them, they'll know something is wrong immediately. You'll be exposed as the source of the compromise." "I understand," Hans said. He thought of the cigarette package discarded on the siding, evidence of officers who had sent men to die while they enjoyed privileges. He thought of the faces he had glimpsed through the train windows, men fleeing the consequences of their actions, while their victims rotted in mass graves across Europe. When do we proceed? The operation was set for March 29th. Cliff personnel moved into position throughout the day, disguising themselves in the ruins and abandoned buildings surrounding the freight yard. Hans reported for his night shift at 11 o'clock p.m., his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. At 2:11 a.m., the ghost train approached. Hans watched it materialize from the darkness, exactly as it had done on previous occasions. His hand moved to the switch controls, and in that moment, every doubt he had suppressed came flooding back. If he was wrong, if this was somehow a legitimate train, he would be responsible for a catastrophic error. If the train's operators had weapons, people could die. If the network discovered his role, both he and Greta could be killed in retaliation. His hand hovered over the switch for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 seconds. Then he thought of Friedrich, dying in the snow at Stalingrad, because men like those aboard this train had started a war of conquest. He thought of Anna, disappeared into the chaos those same men had created. He pulled the switch, sending the ghost train onto the siding, toward the freight yard. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The train continued along the siding, its speed unchanged, giving no indication that anyone aboard had noticed the diversion. Then the train's brakes engaged with a metallic shriek that echoed across the railway yard. Inside Hans's signal box, the telephone rang. Hans stared at it for a moment before answering. "Signal operator Muller," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "This is Brown." His supervisor's voice came through the line. "Why have you diverted the 2:15 supply train onto the western siding?" Hans felt ice in his stomach. Brown knew about the train. Brown was part of the network. Equipment inspection. Hans improvised. "There's been a problem with the southern switches. I'm holding traffic until maintenance arrives. Redirect that train immediately," Brown ordered, his voice sharp. "That's a priority shipment that cannot be delayed." "I can't do that until the switches are inspected," Hans replied. "Safety protocols require—" "I'm coming down there," Brown snapped. "Don't move that train until I arrive." The line went dead. Hans immediately grabbed the emergency signal lantern and flashed it twice toward the freight yard, the prearranged signal that the operation was compromised and CIC personnel should move immediately. What happened next unfolded with controlled chaos. American soldiers and German police emerged from their positions, surrounding the trapped train. Loudspeakers ordered everyone aboard to exit with their hands visible. Hans could see passengers emerging, some 50 men in civilian clothes, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as they realized they had been captured. At the same time, Hans heard a vehicle approaching his signal box at high speed. He recognized his supervisor's car just as armed CIC agents intercepted it. Through his window, Hans watched Brown being pulled from his vehicle and forced to the ground, his protests cut short when Morrison personally placed him under arrest. The entire operation took less than 12 minutes from the train's arrival to the final arrests. When it was over, Morrison climbed the stairs to Hans's signal box, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. 53 passengers, Morrison reported, including 17 men on our war crimes wanted list. The train's operator claims he was hired through intermediaries and had no idea who his passengers were, but we'll see what he says under proper interrogation. "Mr. Muller, you've just dismantled one of the most effective Nazi escape networks in Europe." Hans sat down heavily on his signal operator's chair. "My supervisor was part of it." "Your supervisor was running it," Morrison corrected. Brown was a former Abwehr officer who went underground in 1945. He secured his position in railway administration specifically to facilitate these operations. "We've been looking for him for 8 months. Over the following weeks, the true scale of Die Spin's railway operation became clear. Under interrogation, Brown revealed that the network had moved more than 300 wanted Nazis out of Germany since August 1945, using a sophisticated system of safe houses, forged travel documents, and corrupt railway officials. The trains originated from various points across the American and British occupation zones, collected fugitives at designated pickup points, and transported them to the Austrian border, where they were handed off to another network that moved them through Italy, 2 ships bound for Argentina and other destinations. The intelligence gathered from the captured passengers and documents seized in subsequent raids exposed the identities of dozens of network operatives throughout Germany and Austria. Within 2 months, Allied authorities had arrested more than 90 individuals connected to Die Spin, effectively destroying the organization's ability to function. Among those captured aboard the train that night was Otto Hartmann, the SS Standarten for Hans had seen photographed in the earlier surveillance. Hartmann was tried by an American military tribunal, found guilty of crimes against humanity, and executed in 1947. His testimony before his death implicated several other high-ranking Nazi officials who had believed they had successfully escaped. For Hans Müller, however, the aftermath was complicated. His role in exposing the network had to remain largely secret to protect him from potential retaliation by remaining network sympathizers. The official story released to German newspapers was that American intelligence had intercepted the train following a months-long investigation, with no mention of the railway signal operator whose observations had made the entire operation possible. Hans returned to his night shifts at Ostbahnhof, but his supervisor Braun's arrest and the subsequent investigation into railway administration meant Hans now worked under constant American oversight. Some of his colleagues viewed him with suspicion, suspecting but unable to prove his role in the arrests. Others, those who had quietly opposed the Nazi regime, understood what he had done and respected him for it. On May 8, 1946, the first anniversary of Germany's surrender, Captain Morrison visited Hans at his apartment. "The army wants to recognize your contribution," Morrison said, through his interpreter, "but given the security concerns, it will have to be informal." He handed Hans a letter, typed on U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps letterhead and signed by Morrison's commanding officer. It acknowledged Hans's extraordinary service to the cause of justice and his courage in exposing criminal activity at significant personal risk. The letter carried no official status and would never appear in any public record, but Morrison told Hans it had been placed in his CIC personnel file, where it would remain classified for decades. Hans read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in the drawer where he kept his few precious possessions: his railway certification, his and Greta's marriage certificate, and a photograph of Friedrich in his Wehrmacht uniform taken before he departed for Russia. "This is more recognition than I expected," Hans said quietly. "It's less than you deserve," Morrison replied, "but it's what we can offer given the circumstances." 1 year later, in March 1947, Hans received an unexpected visitor at his signal box during his night shift. A man in his 30s, wearing a worn coat and speaking German with a slight accent, approached and identified himself as David Goldstein, an investigator with the United Nations War Crimes Commission. "Mr. Müller," Goldstein said, "I wanted to meet you personally. One of the men arrested on the train you intercepted was named Victor Kellerman. You wouldn't recognize the name, but he was the SS Hauptsturmführer who commanded the action that destroyed the Polish village, where my parents and younger sister were killed in 1942. They died in a barn that was locked and burned with 73 other people inside." Hans didn't know what to say. The enormity of what these men had done, the suffering they had caused, was beyond his ability to comprehend. "Because you noticed an unmarked train and had the courage to act on your suspicions. Kellerman will face trial instead of living comfortably in Buenos Aires," Goldstein continued. "My family cannot be brought back, but justice can be served. I wanted you to know that your actions mattered. Mr. Müller, they mattered to people you will never meet, victims whose names you will never know. That is worth more than any medal or official commendation." After Goldstein left, Hans stood in his signal box and wept for the first time since receiving the telegram about Friedrich's death. He wept for the millions who had died, for the families destroyed, for the world that had been consumed by madness. And he wept because he had finally done something that mattered, something that stood against the tide of evil he had been powerless to stop during the war years. Hans Müller continued working as a railway signal operator until his retirement in 1961. He and Greta never learned what became of their daughter Anna, one of the millions whose fate remained forever uncertain in the chaos of war's aftermath. They lived modestly on Hans's railway pension, and to all outward appearances, they were simply an elderly couple who had survived the war years and were making the best of the peace. Hans rarely spoke about the night he diverted the ghost train. When occasionally asked by younger railway workers about his experiences during the occupation, He would simply say, "I did my job and tried to do what was right. That's all anyone can do." In 1963, a German researcher investigating Nazi escape networks contacted Hans after discovering declassified American intelligence documents that obliquely referenced the German railway employee whose observations led to the interdiction of a major fugitive transport operation in Munich in March 1946. The researcher asked for an interview, but Hans politely declined. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he told the researcher. "I was just a signal operator who noticed something wrong and reported it to the proper authorities." The real heroes were the men who planned and executed the arrests, risking their lives to bring criminals to justice. The researcher tried to convince him that his story deserved to be told, that it represented an important example of ordinary courage in extraordinary times. Hans remained adamant in his refusal. "If you want to honor what happened that night, honor the victims of the men who were arrested. Tell their stories. Mine is not important." Hans Müller died peacefully in his sleep on November 3, 1973. At the age of 78. His obituary in the Munich newspaper noted that he had been a railway signal operator for 43 years and was survived by his wife Greta. There was no mention of the night in March 1946 when his actions had exposed one of the most significant Nazi escape networks in post-war Europe. A week after his funeral, Greta received a letter from the United States. It was from Robert Morrison, now a retired colonel living in Virginia, who had learned of Hans's death through some channel he didn't specify. "Your husband," Morrison wrote, "was one of the bravest men I ever met, not because he did something dramatic or daring, but because he saw something wrong and chose to act when remaining silent would have been safer and easier. The men arrested, because of his courage, faced justice instead of escaping it. Lives were given meaning that would otherwise have ended in unmarked graves, with no one held accountable. That is the definition of heroism in my book." Greta read the letter several times, trying to reconcile the modest man she had been married to for 53 years with the hero Morrison described. She had known Hans was involved in something during those weeks in 1946, had sensed his tension and concern, but he had never told her the details, had never sought credit or recognition. In the end, she supposed, that was exactly the kind of man Hans had been. Someone who did what needed to be done and then returned to his ordinary life without fanfare or expectation of reward. The full extent of Hans Müller's contribution to post-war justice remained largely unknown until 1998, when the CIA declassified a substantial collection of documents related to Operation Rattlin, the code name for American efforts to interdict Nazi escape networks in occupied Germany. Among these documents was a detailed after-action report on the Munich railway operation of March 29, 1946. The report credited a German railway signal operator, identity protected with providing the crucial intelligence that made the operation possible, and noted that his observations had demonstrated exceptional attention to detail and moral courage in exposing illegal activity at significant personal risk. A German historian named Dr. Katrina Vogel, researching the Nazi escape networks for a comprehensive academic study, identified Hans Müller through cross-referencing the declassified American documents with German railway employment records. She published a detailed account of the operation in 2003, finally bringing Hans's story to public attention nearly 60 years after the events. The article sparked renewed interest in the role of ordinary Germans who had resisted or exposed Nazi criminality during and after the war years. Hans's story became a counterpoint to the narrative of widespread complicity, an example of someone who had lived through the Nazi era without heroic resistance but who acted decisively when given the opportunity to serve justice. In 2006, the Munich city government installed a small memorial plaque at the site of the old Ostbahnhof signal box, which had long since been demolished in the modernization of the railway system. The plaque reads, "In memory of Hans Müller, railway signal operator, whose courage and attention to duty exposed a Nazi escape network operating through this location in 1946. His actions ensured that war criminals faced justice instead of escaping accountability. Ordinary courage in extraordinary times." What makes Hans Müller-esque story so compelling is not the dramatic nature of his actions, but rather their ordinariness. He wasn't a spy or a resistance fighter. He was a railway signal operator, doing his job, who noticed something wrong and made the difficult choice to report it. He took no extraordinary risks, conducted no daring raids, never fired a shot. He simply observed patterns, kept meticulous records, and provided information to the proper authorities. Yet that simple act of moral courage had profound consequences. The 53 men arrested on the train that night included some of the most wanted war criminals in Europe. Their capture and subsequent trials provided justice for thousands of victims and sent a clear message that Nazi criminals could not simply disappear into comfortable anonymity. The intelligence gathered from the operation exposed the structure and methods of die spin, leading to dozens of additional arrests and the effective dismantling of one of the most sophisticated escape networks operating in post-war Europe. Hans's story also illustrates a truth that resonates far beyond its specific historical context, that the maintenance of justice in society depends not only on formal institutions and authorities, but on the willingness of ordinary individuals to notice wrongdoing and report it, even when doing so involves personal risk. The Nazi escape networks functioned because many people chose to look the other way, to convince themselves that what was happening was none of their business, to prioritize their own safety and comfort over the pursuit of justice. Hans could have easily made that same choice. He could have convinced himself that the unmarked trains were simply administrative irregularities, that someone else would surely notice and investigate, that getting involved would only bring trouble. Instead, he documented what he observed, reported it to trustworthy authorities, and accepted the risks that came with taking a moral stand. As we consider Hans Müller's choice on that March night in 1946, we might ask ourselves, what would we have done in his position? Would we have risked our security and career to report suspicious trains? Or would we have convinced ourselves that it wasn't our responsibility, that we shouldn't get involved in matters that didn't directly concern us? And perhaps, more importantly, what patterns are we noticing in our own lives and communities? What wrongdoing do we observe and choose not to report because it would be inconvenient or risky? What injustices do we walk past every day, convincing ourselves that someone else will surely do something about them? The true power of Hans Müller's legacy lies not in celebrating him as an exceptional hero, but in recognizing that his choice is one available to each of us. We all occupy positions where we observe things others might miss, where we possess information that could make a difference if properly reported, where we face the choice between convenient silence and difficult truth-telling. Hans Müller was not born brave. He spent most of his life keeping his head down, following orders, doing his job without questioning the larger system he was part of. But when presented with clear evidence of ongoing criminality, when faced with the choice between complicity and courage, he chose to act. That choice didn't require special training or extraordinary abilities. It required only moral clarity and the willingness to accept the consequences of doing what was right. In a world that often feels overwhelming in its complexity, where problems seem too large for individual action to matter, Hans Müller's story reminds us that history can turn on the smallest of observations and the simplest of choices, that systems of evil depend not only on the active participation of true believers, but on the passive complicity of ordinary people who convince themselves that their individual actions don't matter. The ghost train that passed through Hans Müller's junction in March 1946 was carrying men who had orchestrated the murder of tens of thousands of innocent people. Those men believed they had escaped justice, that their careful planning and secret networks would carry them to safety and comfortable anonymity. They were wrong, because one railway signal operator noticed something unusual and decided to do something about it. Would you have thrown that switch as Hans did? Would you have kept those secret records, reported those observations, taken those risks? Or would you have convinced yourself that the trains passing through your junction were none of your concern? Comment below and share this story so others remember that justice often depends on the courage of ordinary people in ordinary places making extraordinary choices. The frost had melted from the signal box windows by the time Hans finished his shift that morning in March 1946, the rising sun casting long shadows across the railway yard. As he cycled home through the ruins of Munich, past the rubble and the reconstruction crews and the ordinary people beginning another day, he appeared to be nothing more than a tired railway worker heading home after a long night shift. The world would not know for decades what had transpired in those hours, how the methodical observations of one signal operator had exposed the largest Nazi escape network operating in southern Germany and brought dozens of war criminals to justice. And perhaps that, in the end, is the true measure of quiet heroism. not that it seeks recognition or acclaim, but that it does what must be done and then continues on its way, content in the knowledge that some trains, once diverted, can never complete their original journey.